Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we cut through the noise and give you the essential, surprising truths buried in history and research.
Today we're tackling a challenge you brought to us, and it's a fantastic one.
It is. We're doing a deep dive into the British Enlightenment, that period from roughly 1660 to 1800. And the central question is, why is it so often overlooked? Especially when you could argue it was the real engine of our modern world.
It's a great question because, when most people think Age of Reason, their minds immediately go to France.
Right. Voltaire, Rousseau, the ferment before the French Revolution. That's the dramatic story we all know.
Exactly. And the British Enlightenment gets treated like the quiet, sensible, older sibling who already built the factory while everyone else was still arguing about the blueprints.
And it's consistently just sort of left out of the big global histories. It lacks the flair.
And that neglect, which is the first thing our sources really dig into, is historically very peculiar. For decades, the foundational books on the Enlightenment, especially from continental scholars like Cassirer or Schmidt, would just omit English thinkers.
You just skip them.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
They treated the whole movement as a Franco-German thing. And even in the Anglo-American world, there was this strange avoidance. A lot of scholars preferred calling it the Augustan period.
Why? Were they afraid of the word Enlightenment?
It seems like it. They worried it sounded, a bit pretentious, or like this winter for the imagination where everything was too ordered, too restrained.
But that's the great irony, isn't it? Because the British tradition provided the actual scaffolding for the rest of Europe.
It really did. And the French even admitted it, though maybe a bit grudgingly. We have French critics in the 1760s saying that once English letters were tasted, a revolution quickly took place in their own culture. They were reading Locke, they were reading Newton.
And the ultimate symbol of the French Enlightenment, the encyclopedia, that huge multi-volume project to distill all human knowledge, that was basically an imported idea.
It absolutely was. The whole thing, Diderot and D'Alembert's massive project, it started as just a plan to translate an English work.
Which one?
Ephraim Chambers' 2-volume Cyclopedia, which came out in London way back in 1728. So the very model for French rationalism was, at its core, a British commercial success.
And that right there defines the British difference. They weren't just producing ideas, they were producing useful, marketable knowledge.
Exactly. And the reason they could do that, the crucial factor, was their political starting point. The French philosophes had to fight despotism, the church, censorship.
Right.
But the British, after the Glorious Revolution of 1688, they already had a level of liberty their counterparts could only dream of. A Whig peer could boast that they had entire philosophical liberty. Their job wasn't to storm the barricades.
It was to figure out how to best run the system they'd already built.
Oh.
Okay, let's unpack that political foundation, because that's the key. The Glorious Revolution of 1688. It wasn't bloody, it was constitutional. It basically took the entire enlightened wish list and wrote it into law.
It just fundamentally changed the rules of the game. They didn't have to theorize about rights in the abstract, because those rights were now in the law. They were concrete.
So you're talking about things like habeas corpus.
Freedom of the person under habeas corpus, the rule of law that meant even the king was subject to parliament, and critically, a degree of religious toleration.
So with the government already conceding all these key liberties, what was there left for the thinkers to do?
They could shift their focus. It moved from high-level political theory to practical application. How do we use these freedoms to improve society, commerce, ourselves? And a huge part of that was the end of state censorship.
When the Licensing Act lapsed in 1695.
Exactly. Pre-publication censorship just vanished. And that must have been an absolute game changer for the printing industry.
Suddenly you could publish almost anything, even really contentious opinions, without getting prior government approval.
Precisely. You still had libel laws, but the freedom to get a wide range of opinions out there was dramatically greater than anywhere else in Europe. And this environment bred what the sources call a buoyant pragmatism.
A kind of national confidence.
Yes, and that pragmatism fed directly into the economic sphere. It fueled this widespread belief that, each individual could shape their own destiny.
Faber suae quisque fortunae.
Each man is the maker of his own fortune. It became almost a national creed. The whole focus shifted to material progress, to individual effort, to using your freedom to make your life better.
And foreign visitors were completely fascinated by this. They didn't see a nation of abstract philosophers. They saw a nation of builders and traders. Britain was celebrated as a polite and commercial people.
The observations are so telling. One Swiss-American traveler, Louise Simond, noted with real admiration that the English are great in practical mechanics. People constantly praised British manufacturing, especially their instruments, clocks, watches, navigational tools.
So it wasn't just science for science's sake.
No, as science applied to industry and trade, they valued utility above almost everything else.
And this stable commercial environment set the stage for the real philosophical earthquake, which was John Locke. His work basically redefined the starting point for all the thought that came after.
Oh, absolutely. If the political system was born in 1688, you could argue the modern mind was born in 1690 with Locke's essay concerning human understanding.
And his big move, the one that broke with centuries of philosophy, was denying innate ideas, the mind as a tabula rasa.
A blank slate, yes. This is a radical departure from Descartes, from Plato, from everyone who assumed the mind came preloaded with certain truths, like the idea of God or causality. Locke just said no. All knowledge comes from the senses and from reflecting on what the senses tell us.
So what did he put in the place of absolute innate truth?
He substituted it with what he called reasonableness. He argued that knowledge we get from experience can be demonstrable, sure, but it can never be absolutely certain. It can only be probable.
So it's a philosophy that embraces a kind of intellectual humility.
It is. It replaces the hunt for absolute certainty with the pursuit of practical, useful knowledge.
I can see why that would have been so unsettling for people at the time. If there are no innate ideas and all knowledge is just probable, doesn't that open the door to, I don't know, total skepticism? Maybe even religious chaos?
That was exactly the reaction from the establishment. The sources show Locke was heavily criticized. Even his ally, Isaac Newton, at one point accused him of being a Hobbist, which was a seriously dangerous accusation.
Linking him to Thomas Hobbes, so materialism and atheism.
Exactly. And the religious suspicion was even stronger. Someone like Bishop Stillingfleet just saw Locke as actively promoting atheism. Well, the core worry was theological. If everything comes from experience, how do you prove something you can't experience, like the Trinity? Locke's silence on the Trinity wasn't seen as neutral, it was seen as dissent.
And he went even further, didn't he? He destabilized the most fundamental concept of all, the self.
This is maybe the most provocative and enduring part of his philosophy. He defined a person not by their body or their soul, but by their consciousness, the ability to reflect on and unify all your past and present thoughts.
So the self is basically just a string of memories.
In a way, yes.
But what happens if that string breaks, during sleep or mental illness, or even if you're drunk?
That's the problem Locke himself wrestled with. And he came up with this really famous, really provocative thought experiment. He said that if that chain of awareness is broken, say by a short frenzy, then the two states, the sober person and the person in the frenzy, could be, and I'm quoting here, as distinct persons as any two other men in the world. The self was no longer a fixed thing. It was fluid, it was contingent on memory, it was essentially a psychological construct.
That is a staggering idea for 1690. And you can see how it connects back to that buoyant pragmatism. Locke was also intensely suspicious of the very tool of philosophy, language. He basically declared war on fancy rhetoric.
He was a champion of ruthless clarity. He argued that complicated language wasn't for illuminating truth, but for hiding it, for manipulating people. He said, all the art of rhetoric is for nothing else but to insinuate wrong ideas.
He saw it as a kind of intellectual fraud.
He did. He condemned philosophers who used names without ideas, saying they were just speaking gibberish. He demanded plain speaking. And that Lockean mandate for clarity, for pragmatism, became a defining feature of the whole British intellectual style.
Okay, so Locke gives us this new operating system for the mind. But for these ideas to spread, you need infrastructure. If the French had their salons, how did the British get these ideas out of the study and into the real world?
The next huge piece of the puzzle was the physical and social infrastructure that let these ideas circulate at speed. The sources are clear. The pace of life in Britain just dramatically accelerated in the 18th century.
We're talking about a revolution in logistics, better roads, turnpikes, coaching services. They literally shrank the map.
And the data points we have are amazing. Take the trip from Newcastle to London. In 1754, it took 6 days. Just 30 years later, that time was cut in half to 3 days.
50% faster. That means news, letters, people, goods, everything moves twice as fast.
Or even better, Manchester to London. That trip was slashed from 4.5 days down to just 28 hours by 1788. The country was being woven into this Single, unified network.
And these weren't just faster, they were marketed as consumer services. You see those early ads, like for William James's stage wagons, promising very commodious and warm coaches.
Exactly. It's consumer-focused logistics. And this physical acceleration was mirrored by a huge cultural shift, which was all centered on London.
Unlike France, which was more decentralized, London just dominated Britain. It was the cultural magnet, the seat of liberty, the encourager of arts.
And this is where culture moves. It moves out of the elite, courtly spaces and into public metropolitan ones. It moves into theaters, assembly rooms, and maybe most importantly, into the coffee house.
The coffee house was the crucial institution, wasn't it? A sort of miniature free republic.
It was. It was a place for energetic, spontaneous conversation.
Right.
You had major intellectuals like David Hartley who said solitude was one of the greatest obstacles to pleasure and improvement. You needed clubs, assemblies, meeting places.
And anyone could go, more or less.
Absolutely. You had Dryden holding court at Will's. Pope was a regular. But it wasn't just for literary networking. It was for consuming and debating the news. Coffee houses were where you went to read the newspapers and pamphlets.
And this democratic access to information is what just stunned foreign visitors. You mentioned that anecdote about the whitesmith. What does that really tell us?
It tells us that access to serious information was no longer a class privilege. Dr. Thomas Campbell's account of the Chapter Coffee House is priceless. He describes a whitesmith, a craftsman in his work apron, saws under his arm, who walks in, orders a drink and the paper, and reads it with as much ease as a lord.
So you have a working man right there in a public space, participating in the same intellectual world as the gentry. That's a powerful image of liberty and practice.
It signals a whole new era where public opinion matters. And it created the readership that supported the great media revolution of the age, which was print culture. This is where the old system of patronage finally died.
And Samuel Johnson nails it when he says, learning itself is a trade. Authors were done with patronage and were now supported by booksellers and the public.
This was a fundamental change. It created the modern, independent intellectual class. And it was all fueled by the rise of periodicals, like The Spectator.
With that great motto, ex fumo der lucem, to bring light from the smoke. They were selling practical philosophy, moral guidance.
And this guidance started to replace traditional authorities. The public looked to journalists for answers. The Athenian Mercury in the late 17th century answered almost 6,000 public questions on everything from science to
relationship advice. How shall a man know when a lady loves him?
Exactly. And that question sounds simple, but it's profound. It shows people turning away from the local priest or their parents and trusting this anonymous, rational, secular journalist for advice on the most intimate parts of life.
And this accessible style redefined what a thinker was supposed to be. Joseph Addison wanted to bring philosophy out of closets and libraries, to dwell in clubs and assemblies, at tea tables, and in coffee houses.
He was actively creating this new persona, the sociable man of letters, someone who was educated, sure, but avoided pedantry. The emphasis was on conversation, on politeness, on utility. Philosophy became the study of how to live well in this new commercial society.
Which leads us right to the intellectual bedrock of that society. The absolute triumph of the mechanical worldview, all rooted in Newtonianism. The idea of nature as just matter in motion, governed by laws capable of mathematical expression.
And Newtonianism was so much more than just physics. People saw it as an organizational blueprint for everything. Right after Newton died, his disciple de Saguiers published a poem called The Newtonian System of the World, the best model of government.
So the implication was, if the cosmos is rational and harmonious, the state should be too.
Precisely. But interestingly, this worldview was often used to support religion, not undermine it.
How so?
It was seen as an invincible weapon against atheism. The sheer complexity and predictability of the universe, described by these beautiful mathematical laws, surely pointed to a rational creator who kept it all going.
But Newton himself was very strict about his empirical limits. He wouldn't speculate beyond what he could observe.
Famously so. His motto was hypotheses non fingo. I frame no hypotheses. He described how gravity worked with stunning mathematical precision, but he refused to guess why it worked. He stuck to the observable facts.
And this practical, utility-focused science became incredibly popular. It wasn't just kept in universities.
No, it was aggressively spread to the public. You had traveling lecturers, like that same de Saguiers, who would teach Newtonian physics to anyone who could pay for a course of 21 lectures. And these courses were specifically aimed at people altogether unskilled in mathematics, Science was being democratized.
And scientific instruments became consumer goods.
Yes, the trade boomed. People bought telescopes, microscopes, air pumps to display in their drawing rooms. Owning these things was a status symbol. It showed you were part of this new, enlightened, mechanical worldview.
And the goal was always practical application.
Always. As one French observer noted, Britain has more improved the mechanic arts. The focus was on engines, levers, ballistics, anything that could enhance trade and national power.
But this brings up a really important tension. To embrace this commercial utilitarian society, they had to actively fight the prevailing wisdom of the time, which saw luxury and commerce as corrupting.
They absolutely did. They had to dismantle that old classical idea, the one that said luxury is what made Rome fall.
And David Hume was central to that fight.
Hume argued forcefully that a market society and liberty went hand in glove. He showed that commerce consistently fixed its seat in free governments. For him, economic development wasn't a threat to virtue. It was the solution to scarcity, poverty, and barbarism.
And Hume also made a crucial break with Locke on the idea of justice. For Locke, justice was a natural right.
But Hume redefined it completely. He argued justice was an artificial virtue, meaning it was a human convention, a set of rules we invent out of utility and necessity. Since we're all self-interested, we need a stable structure to protect our property.
So for Hume, government isn't just a necessary evil to protect rights that already exist.
Exactly. For Hume, government becomes the source and the sign of social progress. It's the mechanism that provides the stability needed for commerce to flourish. And this lays all the groundwork for Adam Smith.
Right. Smith takes all these ideas about rational self-interest and systematizes them into modern economics.
He grounds his entire worldview in that universal desire of bettering our condition. And then he gives us that perfect, simple example: the butcher, the brewer, and the baker.
Which is so often misunderstood as just a celebration of greed.
It's not about greed, it's about systemic efficiency. Smith states it plainly. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. It's through this predictable self-interest, guided by competition, the invisible hand, that the common good is achieved.
Selfishness is rationalized into a public benefit.
Precisely. And this intense drive for utility and progress, it just permeated everything. It created what you could call a cult of improvement, and you see it most clearly in agriculture.
The image of the neat, enclosed, rational farm becomes this source of national pride.
The reformers were almost evangelical about it. Figures like Arthur Young passionately championed enclosure, arguing the old common fields were a waste of nature. He insisted that rational management would ensure national gain. It was this visible proof that Enlightenment ideas could literally make the land more productive.
And this worldview, this relentless drive for progress through exertion, it even extended into biology, most radically with Erasmus Darwin.
Erasmus Darwin, Charles's grandfather and leading figure in the Industrial Lunar Society, he developed the first really comprehensive materialist theory of evolution in his huge book, Zoonomia.
And this is long before Lamarck or his more famous grandson. What did he actually propose?
He speculated that all warm-blooded animals came from one living filament. But the mechanism for change was completely materialist. He argued species change through adaptation, through exertion in response to pleasure and pain, and this is the key bit, the transmission of those acquired habits to their offspring.
That sounds like a biological justification for the entire industrial economy.
That's exactly what it is. Darwin provides this full, naturalistic rationalization for industrial society. He saw progress not just in the factory, but at the cellular level. Nature itself was in constant, self-driven motion toward a higher, more complex organization, just like the British economy.
So this rise of empirical science and utility had to have a huge effect on traditional religion. As thinkers demanded demonstrable evidence, they started rejecting what they saw as the mystifying rationality of Puritanism or the tyranny of popery.
The result was the rise of what we call rational religion, or deism. The goal was to strip faith down, get rid of superstition and ceremony. The anti-clerical feeling was really strong. You have Tom Paine calling theological persecution priestcraft, and Jeremy Bentham just dismissing theology as bunk.
But the idea was that religion had to be rational and useful.
Exactly. And the most tangible sign of this secular shift was the complete death of witch beliefs among the educated elite by 1700. Belief in magic became associated with, the vulgar, uneducated masses.
So it wasn't that everyone stopped believing overnight, but the influential classes certainly did, and their attitude changed.
Completely. The focus shifted from condemning the witch to pitying the victim. The witch became this pathetic old woman, a victim of popular ignorance.
And fear was replaced by ridicule.
It was. Satirists started using supernatural things only for comedy. You see it in that famous Hogarth engraving, credulity, superstition, and fanaticism. He mocks Methodists as enthusiasts and shows a preacher riding a broomstick with a witch doll.
The message is clear. Believing this stuff is now a sign of being backward and uneducated.
Right. And this secularizing trend then moves right into the most personal sphere, the human body and health. Sickness was no longer seen as a punishment from God.
Which must have been a tremendous psychological relief.
It was. Suffering was demystified. Getting sick wasn't a sign of God's judgment. It was a mechanical problem that could be solved.
And this changed the treatment of mental illness pretty dramatically.
Yes. Lunatics weren't possessed anymore. They were sick. They were suffering from a disordered understanding. This led to new asylum treatments and psychological models based on Locke's idea of the misassociation of ideas. Mental illness was just a malfunction in the mind's recording system. It could be cured with rational re-education.
Even death itself was rationalized, stripped of its old theological terrors.
There was a huge attack on the doctrine of eternal punishment, which was increasingly seen as a fiction of priestcraft used to scare the poor. The ideal shifted from the pious, fearful good death of the Puritans to a peaceful, rational passing, often eased by doctors and opiates.
And you see this clash perfectly in the death of David Hume.
Oh, it's a fantastic story. Hume, the great skeptic, died with total stoical calm, even joking about it. And this just scandalized James Boswell, who felt the skeptic should be terrified on his deathbed. Hume's quiet, rational death was a statement.
And alongside all this, there was a wave of what you could call health populism.
The best example is William Buchan's Domestic Medicine from 1769. This book was a massive bestseller. It promoted an enlightened philosophy of health reason, temperance, hygiene, directly to the average reader.
And the message was basically, you don't have to be a passive victim of fate.
Exactly. He told people the sick no longer needed to abandon themselves to their fate. Knowledge and personal skill could save lives. It was democratic, empowering, and deeply enlightened.
And all this confidence was built on a fundamental rethinking of human nature itself. If the mind is a blank slate, a tabula rasa, then the doctrine of original sin has to be wrong.
It does. Enlightened thinkers basically threw out original sin and instead asserted the dignity of human nature. Humans weren't inherently flawed. They were products of their environment and their education.
And if people are infinitely malleable and improvable, then what's the point of life?
The goal becomes happiness, pleasure. The Enlightenment legitimized the rational pursuit of pleasure, codifying it into utilitarianism's greatest happiness principle.
You even see it in parenting advice. Lord Chesterfield tells his son, pleasure is now the principal remaining part of your education.
And this focus on the inner emotional world kicks off the rise of sensibility in the late Enlightenment. This was a cultural shift that celebrated the emotional self, often explored through the new medium of the novel.
And it even changed the ideal of masculinity.
It did. The culture began to value the man of feeling, someone capable of deep empathy. And views on love changed too. Eros wasn't just for procreation or a sin anymore. It became expressive, the supreme secret of the inner hidden self.
So we've painted this picture of liberty, utility, and self-improvement. But this system of rational efficiency had a dark side. We have to look at how this quest for order created some pretty harsh systems of control, especially for people outside the mainstream.
That's the core tension. The enlightened elite's attitude toward the poor was deeply ambiguous, often contemptuous. They were seen as less than fully rational. The problem people who needed to be managed, not helped.
And any reform was really about productivity and social discipline, not just compassion. If you identified a problem, like prostitution, the solution was always administrative.
Exactly. People debated whether prostitutes were victims of poverty, but the solutions, like the one from Jonas Hanway, were all about creating institutions to turn them into good housekeepers.
Yeah.
The goal was to restore their economic function.
And this drive for rational discipline led to some truly horrifying proposals, even from John Locke himself. His ideas for the poor law are a shocking contrast to his philosophy of liberty.
They are arguably the darkest part of the entire British Enlightened tradition. In his essay on the poor law, Locke diagnosed poverty not as a systemic problem, but as a moral failing, a relaxation of discipline and the corruption of manners.
So the poor were poor because they were lazy and immoral.
That's the implication. And his rational, enlightened solution? Mandatory boot camp working schools. He proposed that pauper children, boys from age 3, girls from age 5, should be forced to labor for up to 14 hours a day.
What do they eat?
Watery gruel. This was rational efficiency applied to social control, prioritizing forced productivity over any kind of welfare.
That chilling vision of efficiency taken to its extreme is maybe best seen in Jeremy Bentham's work.
Oh, absolutely. Bentham's Panopticon prison, with its principle of constant invisible surveillance, was designed to be a mill to grind rogues honest. It's the perfect illustration of how rational control became the enlightened program for forcing social improvement. Utility justified discipline even when it was incredibly punitive.
And what about colonialism? How did these thinkers grapple with an empire that was built on trade, but also on the slave economy?
Many of them did wrestle with it, and they voiced clear anti-colonial feelings. Samuel Johnson said he was always afraid that discoveries would just end in conquest and robbery. And Jerry Bentham flat out told the French revolutionaries to emancipate your colonies.
But their engagement with race and human difference was messy.
Very messy and often contradictory. There was this huge philosophical debate about racial origins, trying to explain why people look different within a rational framework.
What were the two main theories?
The first was monogenesis. This held that all races came from a single origin, from Adam, and that differences like blackness were just caused by the environment by adaptation to the tropics. This fit nicely with Locke's idea of human malleability.
But there was a problem with that theory.
There was. If the sun caused blackness, why didn't the children of Africans born in, say, London, eventually lighten? That anomaly led to the other theory, polygenism.
Separate creations for different races.
Yes. Thinkers like Lord Keynes suggested that there must have been special separate creations. And Keynes went further, hinting that blacks might be a distinct inferior species, maybe even related to apes. So the commitment to empirical observation, ironically, led some down the path to scientific racism.
And you see this clash between abstract theory and reality perfectly in the story of Omai, the Polynesian man brought to England. He was the living embodiment of the noble savage.
He was. He was lionized by high society, painted in classical robes. He was supposed to be proof of the tabula rasa, a perfect savage who could be improved by Western utility and learning.
But the experiment didn't really work out.
It didn't. When he was finally taken back home on Captain Cook's voyage, the great symbol of what he brought back from the West was a jack-in-the-box. He hadn't bothered with the useful agricultural tools. He hadn't embraced the enlightened mission of utility.
And Captain Cook himself, the ultimate pragmatist, kind of debunked the whole noble savage idea based on his own observations.
Cook was a clear-eyed empiricist. He noted that the Tahitians weren't some primitive communists. They were obsessed with private property. And he observed that their sexual morality wasn't really all that different from what was actually practiced in England or France.
Yeah.
The lesson he took away was one of toleration.
Mm.
Understand other cultures on their own terms.
So we arrive at the full picture. The British Enlightenment was overlooked because it was pragmatic, because it was settled, because it lacked the high-stakes drama of France. But its real strength was its relentless focus on pervasive individualism, Locke's empirical self, Hume's utilitarian justice, Smith's self-interested economics, Bentham's rational administration.
And that focus, that rationalization of self-interest for the public good, drove the key transition that defines our modern world. It was the jump from Homo civilis, the civic man of classical virtue, to Homo economicus, the economic man driven by utility and self-interest.
And we celebrate this. We celebrate the commitment to individual liberty, to the rational pursuit of happiness. These ideas are the foundation of our free commercial societies, but we're left grappling with this profound moral tension at its heart.
We have to ask if this unrelenting quest for rational efficiency, exemplified by Locke and Bentham, inadvertently created and justified the very systems of harsh control and discipline that we associate with the worst parts of the industrial age.
Did the desire for rational efficiency and national economic gain ultimately end up prioritizing utility over pure, unconditional compassion? That is the essential, uncomfortable paradox of this unsung engine that built our world. And we'll leave you with that question to think about. Where did the enlightened demands of utility stop and the fundamental needs of humanity begin?